actually going to be discussing information relating to the Helphen, which was pointed out to me by a very astute commenter, so thank you very much for that. Anyway, let's get on with learning about the Helphen. I was once of the mindset that ideas could be generated out of pure effort or imagination. However, having learned about creative psychology during my time in university, creativity is much more akin to restructuring or reformatting of an existing idea, such as how the concept behind airplanes was driven by examining existing knowledge of how other creatures, particularly birds, could fly. While definitions of creativity can vary greatly, one within psychology that I enjoy defines creativity as the tendency to generate or recognize ideas, alternatives, or possibilities that may be useful in solving problems, communicating with others, and entertaining ourselves and others. A hallmark of creativity is remixing existing concepts or ideas into new structures or wholly new concepts, such as the toaster oven, which simply combine the concepts of a toaster and an oven, though this is a very simple example admittedly. This particular aspect of creativity is known as combinatorial creativity, as it includes the exploration of unfamiliar combinations of familiar ideas. Especially in the modern world, combinatorial creativity is frequently used, as many simpler ideas and inventions have led humans to the point in time we currently inhabit, which has then sought to further expand upon our past creative endeavors as humans. I have long held the conviction that no creative work is created in a vacuum, and I believe this to be especially true for such large creative works like Elden Ring, as there are likely many direct and indirect sources of inspiration for the mythos of Elden Ring, and it likely isn't only influenced by Miyazaki and Martin, but also influenced by everyone else who has played a part in crafting the final product that we see. As such, I prefer to look at these lore topics not only from the perspective of the game itself, but also from the perspective of Elden Ring being FromSoft's most monumental achievement, and how this may relate to mythological and theological sources. For this video, I will primarily focus on Norse mythology as it relates to the Helphen, though I would also like to further investigate connections between Elden Ring and Celtic mythology in the near future, as Celtic mythology is essentially the foundation for Norse myths. Recently, the existence of an underworld, spirit world, afterlife, or whatever you decide to call it, has gained more traction in the discussion of the mysteries surrounding the lore of Elden Ring. There is little information on what the Helphen actually is, with the primary source in-game being the Helphen's steeple, which is described as being representative of the lamplight that guides particular souls in the Helphen, specifically those who have died in battle, with the verbatim text reading as follows: greatsword patterned after the black steeple of the Helphen, the lampwood which guides the dead of the spirit world. The lamplight is similar to grace in appearance, only it is said that it can only be seen by those who met their death in battle. The sword is dropped by a Tibia mariner south of Castle Sol and northwest of Snow Valley Ruins Overlook, and is equipped with a unique skill called the Ruinous Ghost Flame, a weapon skill that does not actually inflict fire damage, as the flame is cold, though it certainly looks as though it would inflict fire damage. Interestingly, a deathrite bird can also be found nearby the Tibia mariner in the Helphen steeple, which could relate to the past function and purpose of the deathrite birds. In the time when there was no Erdtree, death was burned in ghost flame. Death birds were the keepers of that fire. The birds are graveyard fire keepers. It is said they rake out their ashen remains of the dead from their kilns. Taking these descriptions into account, it's clear that deathrite birds once served the purpose of burning death, though whether this means actually burning the essence of death, such as how death is physically connected to the rune of death, is unclear, as this could also refer to simply burning the dead to send them on their way to the Helphen. Other connections between the deathrite birds and the Helphen steeple are the two branch sword talismans, with the red-feathered branch sword's description reading, a talisman adorned with red feathers, once used in ancient death rituals, raises attack power when HP is low. The heart sings when one draws close to death, and a glorious end awaits those who cling so tenaciously to life. Moreover, the blue-feathered branch sword's description reads, a talisman adorned with blue feathers, once used in ancient death rituals, raises defense when HP is low. The heart sings when one draws close to death, and thus does one cling so tenaciously to life, to render up a death worth offering. Both of these talismans can be dropped by deathrite birds, and both of the talismans bear a striking resemblance to that of the Helphen steeple, which only strengthens the relationship between the Helphen and deathrite birds. It's quite fitting that these talismans would raise your attack and defense, respectively, when your health drops below a certain point, which harkens back to the final line of each description. The heart sings when one draws close to death, and thus does one cling so tenaciously to life, with the blue-feathered talisman adding, to render up a death worth offering, at the end. This line is significant, as it further demonstrates that those who try to cling to life, essentially those who push forward no matter the odds, are to receive a more glorious afterlife, much like the concept of the Norse Valhalla, or Hall of the Fallen. While this line is significant and quite clearly is a direct reference to warriors dying in battle and entering Valhalla, I would like to point out that this is not actually a condition to enter Valhalla, at least not one that can directly be found in any Norse mythology. In fact, the idea of those who fall in battle entering Valhalla is actually a more modern addition to the mythos, with a 13th century scholar Snorri Sturluson having added this interpretation in his collection of Norse myths titled the Prose Edda, which is not to be confused with the Poetic Edda, which, much like the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Poetic Edda is the primary source of Norse myths, similar to the Iliad and the Odyssey being the primary source of Greek myths. Moreover, Snorri Sturluson contradicted himself several times in the Prose Edda, discussing how the god Balder entered Hell after his death, despite Sturluson himself previously having said those who die in battle should enter Valhalla. The reason this matters is because Sturluson recounts the tale of Balder, and despite his own clarifications about Valhalla previously, Balder ends up going to Hell, even though he died in a horrifically gruesome battle. The guy couldn't even follow his own rules. Though this is likely due to Sturluson being a Christian scholar living in a time in which many Norse traditions relating to their mythology were no longer practiced, and his interpretation of Norse myths is typically regarded as being anachronistic, and an effort on his part to reconcile Norse traditions with the origins of Christianity, as it was also Sturluson who depicted the goddess Hel and the underworld Hel in a similar light to the Christian Hell, despite there actually being very few similarities between the two. I'm bringing attention to this so I don't have to continue distinguishing between the Poetic and Prose Edda when I discuss the Helphen, which shares connections both with the original Poetic Edda and with the interpretations of the Prose Edda. I also thought it pertinent to mention, as most people view Norse mythology through the lens of the Prose Edda, which explains some of the choices made in-game, though it is arguably not drawing from the correct mythological sources, and I want to demonstrate how these concepts merge and change over time, especially how they merge with other aspects of Norse mythology, which can provide an excellent example of combinatorial creativity. Let us start with the name of the underworld, the Helphen. The most obvious connection between the Helphen and Hell is of course the name, as the Helphen includes the word Hell and even uses a singular L. Moreover, in Norse mythology, Hell is invariably referred to as Helheim, a name that bears a striking similarity to Helphen, though it is altered just enough to be considered a separate word and location. To clear up any confusion, the word Hell means hidden, and comes from Halio, meaning concealed place. Thus, the term Hell does not necessarily denote a torturous afterlife. It simply refers to a location that is hidden, typically underground. In fact, in Norse tradition, there is no consistent fate of the dead, nor did they have the concept of damnation and salvation, hence why the Prose Edda has an inaccurate depiction of Hell being a place of immense pain and torture, as Hell is the catch-all underworld for the Norse, and was typically viewed in a neutral or even positive light. There are no souls of the damned, so to speak, in Hell or Helheim, as virtually everyone wound up there unless you were to die in other specific locations or were chosen to enter Valhalla by Odin and his Valkyries. To illustrate this point, in Norse tradition, it was also believed that those who died at sea would enter the underwater home of the giantess Ran, and live on underwater. Similarly, other forms of spirit realms or underworlds in Norse mythology are not typically related to good or evil actions one commits, but more so where they died, though the Norse believed their people continued to live on in these realms in some capacity similar to when they were alive, such as eating, drinking, partying, and managing relationships. It simply was the next step in their journey. Hell is not bliss nor torment, but rather a continuation of life in many ways. As previously stated, the Helphen not only draws upon Hell as a source, though it also appears to take some inspiration from the Prose Edda, as the Helphen steeple claims only those who met their end in battle can be guided by the lamplight in the Helphen. And while it may not seem important at first, I believe the color of this grace-like substance is likely red, which may point to a connection between the Helphen and the Rune of Death, or perhaps it's a more obscure reference to one of the outer gods, namely the Formless Mother. The Rune of Death is associated with a red and black flame-like aura, and while this could connect to the Helphen, as it is the realm of the dead, the red glow used to summon skeletons from their graves by enemies such as Tibia mariners lacks the same coloration, as the aura that surrounds the undead when they rise is a more solid red, and is more akin to the blood magic used by Moog and the Formless Mother. The red aura that summons the undead may also relate to the concept of the guiding lamp in the Helphen, as perhaps only those who have died in battle and been deemed worthy warriors, can be raised from the dead to battle once again. While this is just speculation, I think there could be some truth in this, as the red aura is particularly given to the undead summoned from the ground, which relates quite well to the Prose Edda version of Valhalla, in which the gruesome and painful death is required to enter Valhalla and dine with Odin. Perhaps the Helphen is actually a merging of Hell and Valhalla, as the description of the Helphen is incredibly similar to that of Hell, and serves a similar function as Valhalla in the Prose Edda, and powerful warriors are guided to a specific location in the Helphen to perhaps one day be summoned to fight again. Hell is described as being freezing cold, arguably colder than Niflheim, though in some sources Helheim and Niflheim are considered the same location or parts of the same region. Valhalla means Hall of the Fallen, and I don't think it too big a stretch to say that there is perhaps some equivalent to Valhalla in the Helphen, as the Helphen steeple specifically says only those who die in battle are guided by the Red Grace, which suggests they live within a region of the Helphen separate from those who died natural deaths. Though, in Norse mythology, the warriors were actually chosen directly by Odin and his Valkyries to live on in Valhalla among the gods, as Valhalla is actually a part of Asgard. Moreover, the purpose of selecting warriors to remain in Valhalla is so the gods can recruit legendary warriors to fight alongside them during the end of days, Ragnarok. Thus, it makes me wonder why those who die in battle are chosen to be guided by the red grace of the Helphen, because if particular people are chosen to walk a specific path in the Helphen, and perhaps themselves reach the black tree that supposedly resides there, why is it happening? And who, if anyone, does it benefit? My thoughts on this are that I believe there to be an outer god residing in the Helphen, and this could perhaps have been one of the factors that led Marika to shatter the Elden Ring and hide away destined death with Malekith. If people are no longer allowed to enter the Helphen, even those who have died in battle, it would stand to reason that this would benefit Marika and her god, the Greater Will, more than it would benefit the god in the control of the Helphen. While simply speculation, I would not find it too surprising to learn that Marika was fearful of the other outer gods, and perhaps was most afraid of the outer god ruling the Helphen. While I don't have much evidence other than the color red being associated with summoning undead warriors, this could be connected to the Formless Mother, the patron deity of Mohg, and his failed Mohgwyn dynasty. I wonder if Marika was fearful of the army that could be built in the Helphen, as people to this day have continued to be born and have continued to die, and this only increases the number of souls that are gathered in the underworld. We already know that Marika has sought to extinguish other gods who oppose the Greater Will, and perhaps sealing away the Rune of Death was a strategic move on Marika's part to prevent the god of the Helphen from accruing too much power for her to handle. This works well with how death is currently handled in the Lands Between, as death essentially does not exist without the Rune of Death and the Elden Ring, and people are forced to live long beyond their years, and become shells of the humans they once were. While this fate is a horrific one indeed, to Marika, the sacrifice may have been necessary to prevent the power from being usurped by an outer god that was accruing power as a result of Marika's conquest over other creatures and gods, namely the giants and their fell god. Moreover, blood is typically associated with death and injury, and as such, it would be somewhat fitting if the Formless Mother were the ruler of the Helphen, as we have already seen that the Formless Mother wishes to bring down the Golden Order and chose Mohg as her champion. The fact that the substance and lamplight that guides souls of the dead is said to be similar to the grace of the Lands Between, especially leads me to believe that there is an outer god in the Helphen, as grace in the Lands Between only exists because of the Greater Will. And in Norse mythology, it's said that those who dwelled in Asgard received a form of grace from Odin that was representative of communion with divinity, much like grace is seen as a communion with the Greater Will in Elden Ring. And to expand upon that, it leads me to believe that other gods in Elden Ring could produce and proliferate a similar grace-like substance that leads souls on what this god views as the correct path. Thus, the grace-like lamp in the Helphen could be representative of the Formless Mother, or another separate outer god sharing their power with the souls of dead warriors to eventually use in the decisive battle against their foes, that are perhaps Marika and the Greater Will. Just to add a little bit more to this speculation, the blood the Formless Mother produces could even be an ability she has due to living in the underworld, as her realm could be more caked in blood than the Lands Between, but we simply don't have enough information to make that claim definitively. To help bolster the existence of the Helphen, and perhaps to better connect it to Norse mythology, the ghostly candlewoods that can be found in various regions of the lands between are likely connected to the Helphen as well, and may also share a connection with Norse shamanism, specifically the concept of shamanic death, which involves a spiritual death and rebirth that allows one to roam the lands as a spirit and guide others to the underworld. In Elden Ring, when you come across one of the candlewoods, a frail-looking spirit will appear and lead you to a remote region, often one located underground or on the side of a cliff. The parallels are readily apparent, though the exact state of the spirits is unknown, as they could be representative of those who are undergoing a shamanic journey, or they could simply be spirits that guide the way to the underground secrets, similar to the Red Grace guiding those who have fallen to a specific region of the Helphen. The candlewood has a distinct spectral appearance, similar to that of a tibia mariner, as well as other spirits seen in games such as helpful ones trapped in their ashes, and this demonstrates that these spirits all take on a similar appearance, which could suggest they are all destined for the same location, the Helphen. Though, if I'm being honest, I am currently unsure as to how bones play into death in the Helphen, as there must be a reason tibia mariners are named as such, and as to why it would seem the skeletons are the preferred choice of summoning for enemies such as the tibia mariner, with the only enemy that really calls spirits in their spectral form being the spirit-calling snails, and I honestly have no idea what's going on with those things, so that may have to be the subject of a video another day. Regardless, bones seem to play a factor in the summoning of spirits, as well as the possible destruction or transference of the spirit that occurs when the ghost flame is used to burn the bodies of the dead by the Deathrite birds. Moreover, you must destroy the bones of an undead enemy to ensure that they remain dead, which, once again, points to bones being significant, though why this is, I'm not entirely sure. Now, knowing about the existence of an underworld in Elden Ring, it raises more questions about what exactly the lands between actually are, as the lands appear to have a tenuous relationship with immortality and death, and perhaps could be analogous for Asgard, the realm of the gods, or perhaps even an analog for the 9 realms of the cosmos themselves, though I would need to conduct more research to analyze those comparisons. However, currently, it would appear that there are a few items and objects in-game that point to and describe an underworld separate from the lands between, which could throw a wrench in theories that the lands between are themselves a form of underworld or spirit world, though both could still be true. The Helphen could be the underworld, and the lands between could be a separate spirit or divine realm, as there is clearly something unique about the lands between, as it is surrounded by water in a deep fog, which makes it sound quite similar to the Celtic otherworld Tir na Nog. I could easily see the lamplight that guides the dead who have fallen in battle as actually being the same hue or color as the ghost flame, though this is speculation as much as the color red being the color representative of the Helphen lamplight, with the primary reason for this being the candlewoods with spirit guides found around the map. Though, I do hesitate to say the grace in the Helphen is necessarily that of a ghostly cold blue flame, as this color is more representative of the candlewood, which isn't quite the same as the other items relating to the Helphen, such as the Helphen steeple. Moreover, the ghost flame color is seen more commonly as the same color as spirits themselves, as well as that of the candlewood, whereas warriors summoned into skeletons by tibia mariners emit a red glow, which again may represent whether or not those people died in battle or of natural causes. It could perhaps be inferred that red relates to those who died in battle and entered the Helphen, whereas spirits with a blue hue may be those who died of natural causes and entered the Helphen as well, or perhaps have been barred from entering the Helphen, such as the spirits housed within the spirit ashes, as people have been unable to truly experience death in the lands between. As a result of Marika sealing away destined death, death is no longer destined, and this could perhaps put Marika at odds with the ruler of the Helphen, whether that be the Formless Mother or not, as now the natural order within the Helphen would have been thrown into turmoil, and traditions relating to the Helphen have essentially been lost, as few items even describe the existence of the underworld, which infers to me that at least traditions relating to death in the Helphen likely involved another outer god, as many traditions and outer gods were spurned by Marika and the Greater Will, as the Greater Will has imposed itself as the supreme outer god in the lands between, and the Helphen may have been obscured because of its connections to a blasphemous god, much like the removal of traditions relating to the Crucible or the Flame of the Fell god. The Helphen may be an underworld that Marika has rejected in the name of the Greater Will and its Golden Order. While there are many unanswered questions and mysteries, I hope that the Elden Ring community can come together to piece it all together eventually, as there is clearly far too much for a few people to decipher on their own. Elden Ring, a game that on the surface is much more approachable and relatable to the masses, in a way that other From Software titles have simply not been capable of achieving. Now, why is this? Unquestionably, there is a myriad of gameplay choices that From Software had to make for Elden Ring to so quickly become the company's most accessible and commercially successful title. However, I don't believe the gameplay evolution of From Software's games is enough to warrant such an explosive and visceral reaction to the game, nor do I feel as though it explains the clear interest people have taken in the world, and story of Elden Ring, and the lands between. In the past, From Software games such as Dark Souls were incredibly esoteric, and particularly appealed to those who had an interest or knowledge of the Japanese manga, Berserk, as well as some Western references, such as Gwyn being an analog for Zeus, as he is a lightning-wielding leader of the gods. Though, interestingly, the mythological and fictional sources of inspiration in the Dark Souls series were arguably too broad, as the primary inspiration was the aforementioned Berserk. However, From Software also drew from Greek, Roman, and Anglo-Saxon sources, which in my eyes diluted the focus of the story, or it could have at least influenced others to experience a similar thought. If you want to see the similarities and the direct impact Berserk has had on the creation of Dark Souls, I recommend checking out 61 references of Berserk in Dark Souls, including Elden Ring, by Zvoke. He does include some inspiration from Berserk to Elden Ring, though the video is primarily focused on Dark Souls, as it's more directly connected to Berserk. I by no means think the Dark Souls games have weak stories, though they do feel a bit more referential to source material, as opposed to integrating the source material with their own created world. And I think this is one of the primary differences from other From Software titles and why Elden Ring has amassed such incredible financial and critical success, as the game does have clear inspirations, though they fit together incredibly well and largely all relate to the same mythological concepts that cultures have been using for thousands of years. I am specifically talking about the Erdtree and the lands between, which can be viewed as analogues for the symbolic Tree of Life, as well as a land that could perhaps represent a form of otherworldly afterlife or purgatory, though that part is likely the most unclear and mysterious subject of the game. Where, what exactly, are the lands between? Moreover, an inspiration I would like to mention briefly that most are aware of when it comes to Elden Ring, is that it has some clear inspiration from J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, as the plot does center around different factions of a kingdom vying for rings of power. I find this to be incredibly fitting with the themes, setting, and narrative of Elden Ring, as Lord of the Rings was heavily inspired from a variety of sources, though one of the primary works he referenced was Beowulf, an Old English story about a Scandinavian warrior who accomplished many feats, one of which being slaying a dragon. Getting all Jordan Peterson up in here. Elden Ring has some clear Norse and Scandinavian influences, both in terms of story and setting, which seem to go along well with their homage to the Lord of the Rings, as are both heavily influenced by Northern European sources. With the inclusion of George R.R. Martin in the development of the lore and world of Elden Ring, it's clear that it has even more European fantasy thrown in alongside From Software's usual Berserk inspiration, and a dash of Lord of the Rings, which isn't all that surprising considering George's past works, as well as From Software's interest in a more European fantasy setting. While I have laid down the groundwork for explaining the major sources of inspiration, I want to explore the most obvious and obscure potential sources of inspiration that both Miyazaki and Martin were influenced by during the creation of Elden Ring. Specifically, I will be examining the Erdtree in the setting of the game, the lands between, as these aspects of Elden Ring have both obvious as well as more obscure sources of influence, all of which relate to mythologies and religions around the globe. This video will by no means be providing an exhaustive analysis of influences for the Erdtree as well as the lands between. However, I believe I have curated most of the religious and mythological concepts and tales that relate to Elden Ring. I also apologize for all the terrible pronunciation you're about to hear, though, with that out of the way, let's get started. The most obvious mythological connection that people have made, and are already and continuing to talk about, is the massive world tree, Yggdrasil, from Norse mythology, which connects and holds the cosmos together. Yggdrasil connects the heavens to the underworlds, with humanity existing in between the roots and branches. So you could almost say that Norse mythology placed humans in what could be considered the lands between, specifically the lands between heaven and hell. There isn't a clearly defined heaven or underworld in Elden Ring, however the deep-root depths of the Erdtree appear quite symbolic of underworld settings, particularly as it's filled to the brim with monstrously large creatures, and the frog-like creatures that spew pure death breath. Moreover, in the deep-root depths, a powerful dragon can be fought, and this could be a reference to the dragon Nidhogg, the dragon in Norse mythology that gnaws at the roots of the world tree. Clearly, the dragon fought at the roots of the Erdtree is a blight on the tree, and may be inspired by Nidhogg, And though not a perfect comparison, Nidhogg is typically described as being black and deep red, much like the dragon Fortisax fought at the base of the Erdtree. Moreover, the branches of the Erdtree can be seen as being symbolic of the power and grace of the Greater Will overseeing the lands between, representing the higher status of the Greater Will in comparison to humanity, much like the gods in Asgard who rest atop Yggdrasil. Furthermore, the Norse gods living atop Yggdrasil were quite fond of humanity, shared their power and wisdom with humanity, and chose to protect them against the beasts of the 9 underworlds, upon which the Asgardians' grace did not shine, though it did shine upon Midgard, the land between the gods and demonic entities. The aesthetic choices for the Erdtree are also very similar to depictions of Yggdrasil, as anyone with eyes can see when comparing the two. Yggdrasil is often shown as having a golden color, or at the very least is often depicted emanating golden light from its branches, which again is reminiscent of the Erdtree. The tree also grants immense power and wisdom to those willing to make a sacrifice to it, which could perhaps be loosely linked to the sacrifice needed to burn away the thorns and enter the Erdtree that is carried out in-game by Melina. In Norse mythology, Odin sacrifices himself to Yggdrasil to gain immense wisdom and knowledge of the universe, which subsequently leads to an immense increase in his power and authority over his subjects, which can be related to Melina, though realistically it's more similar to Marika, who perhaps had to make a similar sacrifice to gain her godlike status, as she did have to become the vessel for the power she sought, irrevocably altering her very being. And to this day, we still do not know entirely what makes someone an Empyrean, and perhaps there was some sort of sacrifice that Marika had to make. Perhaps most pertinent, Odin gained the ability to read runes from making the sacrifice to Yggdrasil, much like Marika gaining the power of the runes within the Elden Ring when becoming an earthly avatar for the Greater Will. The runes that Odin discovered were used to alter the laws of the cosmos and reality itself, much like the abilities given to the Elden Ring, which dictates the physical laws of the lands between. However, unlike Yggdrasil, the Erdtree can only dictate the laws of reality within the lands between, whereas the runes written into Yggdrasil by Odin would carry changes throughout all of the realms connected to the tree. Regardless of this difference, runes in both Elden Ring and Norse mythology are used to manipulate and change reality as those in possession of the runes see fit, which tracks well with the various endings of Elden Ring, as different runes can be used to have different effects on the lands between as they influence the Elden Ring and Erdtree to alter how the laws of reality function in the lands. Furthermore, Yggdrasil, like the Erdtree, essentially acts as a recycling plant for the souls of the dead. In Elden Ring, the shattering of the Elden Ring has led to the Erdtree rejecting souls and breaking the cycle of life and death it brought with it. Yggdrasil was also governed by a greater will and lived in a cycle, as the cosmos in Norse mythology is cyclical, in a constant cycle of destruction and reconstruction, with Ragnarok always bringing an end to the universe, yet always restarting it as well. In a sense, the shattering of the Elden Ring and the war it brewed can be viewed as Ragnarok in the lands between, as the world is chaotic and falling apart, yet you can correct it and renew the cycle of the Erdtree. A fascinating connection I found in my research is to Tir na Nog. Tir na Nog is one of the various names for the Celtic Otherworld, though it's somewhat unclear if Tir na Nog actually represents the entirety of the Celtic Otherworld, or if it is simply a part of it. Nonetheless, the most prominent connections to the lands between are easily the existence of a tree of life at its center, as well as the land being surrounded by a thick, deep fog. In Tales of Tir na Nog, there are several ways described in which one could travel there, though one of the most prevalent is that one must journey through a sea of fog to reach the land, which is adorned with a massive tree. The ruler of Tir na Nog is a god considered to be the progenitor of humanity, and stands tall as a proud and powerful warrior, with a golden-haired wife at his side. Similar to the lands between, Tir na Nog is reached by passing a great fog, and was once ruled by a great warrior and his golden-haired wife, though in Elden Ring, it is the golden-haired wife, Marika, who is more akin to a god. Moreover, both the lands between and Tir na Nog are islands that seem to exist outside of the rest of reality. Another interesting connection to many of the tales of Tir na Nog is the presence of heroes traveling to the land via a magic white mare, the most prominent of which is mentioned in the tale of Oisin, and is quite reminiscent of the trusty and noble steed of the tarnished Torrent. The tree in Tir na Nog also is said to house the souls of the dead, represented by singing birds in the tree. The branches of the trees also bear golden apples, which may not have a direct comparison to Elden Ring, though it is quite similar to many other tales of trees of life. The tree of life in Tir na Nog was called Cran Bathad by ancient Celtics, and like Yggdrasil, connected the lands of the underworld. Moreover, the Celts believed trees to be living mystical beings, and the humans actually came from trees, and would again be trees after death, which interestingly can be related to many of the corpses not only seen in Elden Ring, but in many of From Software games, as beings transforming into trees seem to be a popular motif in their works. The Celts viewed cutting down trees, particularly Cran Bethad, as a grave sin, much as burning the Erdtree in Elden Ring is seen as a cardinal sin, as the tree is similarly revered in both cultures. In broad terms, Christianity has several references to a tree of life, as well as to a tree of knowledge of good and evil, both of which can be found in various versions of the Bible, as well in some of the apocryphal texts that had way cooler takes on the biblical tales. The Tree of Life is mentioned less than the Tree of Knowledge of Good and Evil, though it is apparently also present in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve decide to break God's rule and are subsequently cast out from the garden. Right off the bat, the Garden of Eden can be seen as a parallel for the lands between, as there were arbitrary rules the inhabitants had to follow in order to receive blessings such as immortality from God. While it's clear in Elden Ring that the Erdtree does not necessarily provide eternal life, as this was the result of the Rune of Death being removed from the Elden Ring, the Erdtree does effectively grant immortality through its blessings, as well as its ability to recycle the soul of each inhabitant who dies, and then reincarnate them in a new body. Rather than being cast out of the lands between and becoming tarnished, Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, unable to receive God's blessings, and no longer had access to the sacred trees. A sect of Christians called the Gnostics, or Gnostics, I'm not entirely sure which is actually correct, believed in and made reference to a golden sun-colored tree north of paradise that could grant eternal life. Interestingly, some viewed the roots of the tree negatively though, believing it to be a source of evil, similar to the distorted and malformed state of the roots of the Erdtree can be seen in as a result of Godwyn's corpse fusing with the tree. Trees are quite sacred in Islam, and the most revered of these sacred trees is known as the Tree of Immortality, which again relates to the immortality that can effectively be granted through the grace of the Erdtree. The Tree of Immortality in Islam is often meant to symbolize a code or way of life that people are meant to follow, much like the Golden Order of the Greater Will, represented by the Erdtree. Interestingly, the only tree in Eden in Islam is the Tree of Immortality, and the primary reason Adam and Eve were not meant to eat from the tree is because they likely would have become angels, which raises a parallel to the Erdtree, as it too is associated with great power and apparent immortality when certain conditions are met. Old Hebrew and Judaic mysticism involved a tree of life called Etz Chaim. Definitely did not get that right, probably needed to, speak from the back of my throat a bit more, but hopefully people will let it pass. Anyway, Etz Chaim, and similar to Christianity, is distinct from the Tree of Knowledge of Good and Evil. The tree was closely associated with wisdom and immortality, as well as served as the influence for the Kabbalah, a symbolic representation of the Tree of Life that bears striking similarities to the Eastern concept of chakras. The Tree of Life, as well as the Kabbalah, represent connections between humans, angels, and God, and the Tree of Life could be used to gain enlightenment. While quite speculative, I do wonder how much angels and God can act as parallels for the demigods in Elden Ring and the Greater Will. The demigods are clearly nowhere near the power of the Greater Will, and were initially servants of the Greater Will, and even they do not understand the machinations or intentions of the Greater Will itself. Obviously, this theme can be found in Christianity as well. In Elden Ring, the grace of the Golden Order in the Erdtree appears to be arbitrarily given and taken away, similar to how God acts in the Book of Enoch, an apocryphal book used by some in the Hebrew mysticism. In the Book of Enoch, God grants eternal life to those whose names have been written in the Book of Life by allowing them to eat the fruit from the Tree of Life. Much like the Greater Will, God gives no direct or tangible reasoning as to why not all were given his blessing, yet the connection seems apparent. Hinduism has a world or cosmic tree, though this version has the tree growing upside down with the roots connecting to the heavens, and the branches and leaves reaching down to the earth. Interestingly, the fact that the tree is upside down means those living on Earth actually receive plenty of mystical blessings from the branches and leaves of the tree, much in the way the leaves of the Erdtree spread throughout the lands between and grant grace to the people. Known as Akshaya Vata, or Immortal Tree, the Hindu world tree is also strikingly similar to the Erdtree, as it is described as resplendent in gold, which evokes the imagery of the ever-golden Erdtree. Moreover, the Akshaya Vata represents the path to salvation in Hinduism, similar to how the Golden Order of the Elden Ring and Erdtree represent what the Greater Will believes to be the correct way of life, similar to the plan of Krishna in Hinduism, who planted the tree to provide humans with a path to salvation in his eyes. one that will bring them closer to the gods and the heavens themselves. Buddhism also has references to a tree of life, specifically known as the Bodhi or Bodhi tree. I'm going to go with Bodhi on this one, even though I have not double-checked that. The Bodhi tree is also known as the Tree of Enlightenment, as it's believed that Mahatma Gandhi, the original Buddha, achieved spiritual enlightenment, or nirvana, by sitting underneath this tree. A loose connection can be seen between the wisdom granted by the Bodhi tree and the enlightenment that one can gain by having high levels of faith in Elden Ring, as this allows the player to use spells such as the Law of Regression, which reveal the secrets of the world, which could be connected to wisdom and spiritual enlightenment. Moreover, those connected to the Erdtree seem to have prophetic abilities, as Marika and the Prophets of the Golden Order demonstrate this, which may relate to the concept of spiritual enlightenment. Though with that said, the Bodhi tree seems to have more clear parallels to Odin's experience with Yggdrasil, more than anything directly from Elden Ring. So in this one, I do want to forewarn you that I really do not know how to say the name of this religion and people, as well as a lot of the names of their trees, so bear with me. The Serer religion originates from Senegal in West Africa, and like many of the aforementioned cultures and religions across the globe, trees were viewed as sacred entities. Specifically, the Noctugal tree is considered to be the first tree to bloom in the primordial swamp of creation that spawned all of existence. There is some dispute among Serer scholars about the original sacred tree, as there is also great significance placed on other trees such as the Nakuf, Sas, and Baobab. However, the other trees were still considered sacred, with the Sas symbolizing overall health, and the Nakuf was a source of anti-venom from snake bites. The significance of a sacred tree in the Serer religion was largely determined by the Serer saints who were associated with them, with the more sacred and revered of the trees being represented by these saints, who were often depicted as snakes, interestingly enough. Much of the Serer religion and traditions have been passed down orally, thus there is little in the way of historical texts that discuss why the Noctugal tree was so revered in particular, though what little is known would suggest that the tree was used to cure a myriad of ailments, and was used to help treat wounds and prevent infection. While not as clear-cut as some of the other connections, it would still seem this religion shares similarities with Elden Ring's Erdtree, if only for reverence being given to a sacred tree that provides life-prolonging benefits. Moreover, while the Sas tree is a bit of a contentious topic among some Serer scholars, the remaining documentation for the significance of the Sas tree in their mythology does seem to put it closer to the prototypical tree of life found in many other cultures, as the tree was said to prolong human life and provide various boons to its adherents. Similar to the blessing granted by being born at the foot of the Erdtree in Elden Ring, proponents of the Sas claimed that being born at the foot of the Sas tree would give the child a long, healthy, and lucky life. Furthermore, the Sas tree could supposedly heal those who touched its bark. What I find most fascinating about the Sas tree is its downfall, so to speak, as the Sas tree is said to have abused its supernatural powers and overstepped its bounds in the eyes of the Serer people, and as such, the tree fell in disgrace without the support of its followers. While this may be a bit of a stretch, the Sas tree eventually became to be known as the Nias tree by some, which variably translates to scar or clot, words that, when said together, sound eerily similar to the potent poison permeating the lands between in Elden Ring, the Scarlet Rot. When the Sas tree fell out of favor with the Serer people, they began to focus on the Somb, a very large tree in Serer country that is very resistant to rot, much like the Erdtree of Elden Ring, as the tree continues to shine golden despite the pervasive rot at its roots and across the lands between. The Orthodox Serer religion today has the Somb tree rivaling the Noctugal for the status as the Tree of Life, as the Somb symbolizes immortality, and is said to be the seed that produced all plant life on Earth, much like the golden seeds of the Erdtree, which are used to enhance Crimson Tears, which develop your character further and push you ever closer to immortality through its mystical healing properties that can heal any injury or ailment. Finally, reincarnation is a bit different from the cycle in Elden Ring, yet there is still a pertinent connection I wanted to mention. Reincarnation is a strongly held belief in the Serer religion, and it involves passing through several stages of reincarnation. In the lands between, souls are essentially recycled in the Erdtree, as souls enter the tree and are placed into new bodies. This is similar to the Nagan Mabul tree, which is said to exist above a massive chasm in which reincarnating souls are housed. The Serer religion involves many sacred trees, unlike the single massive Erdtree in Elden Ring, yet there are arguably still several connections between these concepts, as the Erdtree is also related to the concept of immortality, reincarnation, and granting blessings to its adherents. Moreover, the lands between have minor Erdtrees sprouting up all over the place, which is somewhat reminiscent of the Psalm tree producing a great deal of plant life across the realm, though this connection may fit better in another culture's interpretation of the Tree of Life mythos. While baobab trees are also quite sacred in the Serra religion, unlike the previous trees, they are not necessarily considered primordial, and are quite numerous in comparison to the Sas or Nakal, though these trees are also associated with power and life, continuing the pattern of human reverence for trees, especially for hardy, awe-inspiring ones. Just look at these trees. Of course I probably would have found these to be sacred if I were among the Serra people. Native Americans are by no means a single entity in regard to culture, religion, or even values. So I'd like to present an interpretation of the importance of the concept of a sacred tree in Native American cultures, a tradition that has been continued to be carried out by the Naraya Cultural Preservation Center. Is called Dance for All People, which is a tradition of choosing a tree that you find significant and sacred, and engaging in a dancing ritual around the tree. As a quick note, Naraya is an indigenous term that roughly translates to moon, and in this instance is being used as representing a large collection of Native American peoples and beliefs. Like many other cultures and characters in Elden Ring, viewing trees as sacred and deserving reverence is a common pattern among humans in almost any time or medium. Now I would like to read some excerpts from the Dance for All People website, which quite effectively describes the concept of a sacred tree in their own culture, as well as cultures around the world. The ceremonial element for today's reflection is the Tree of Life, aka the Tree of Peace, the Wood of the Cross. The sacred tree can be found in every tradition, in every culture since the dawn of time. From the book The Sacred Tree. The Creator has planted a sacred tree under which they may gather, and there find healing power, wisdom, and security. The roots of this tree spread deep into the body of Mother Earth. Its branches reach upward like hands praying to Father Sky. The fruits of this tree are the good things the Creator has given to the people, teachings that show the path to love, compassion, generosity, patience, wisdom, justice, courage, respect, humility, and many other wonderful gifts. The energy of spirit circulates from and around the branches and roots. Through the tree, spirit permeates the circle, moving in seen and unseen ways. The tree receives our prayers and transmutes them into other dimensions. Just as it transforms carbon monoxide into life-giving oxygen, so does it empower and move our prayers. The tree is in the middle of the circle, because it is like the hub of a wheel, the energetic focal point where the energy of the dance can move and circulate most efficiently. The objects we place on the tree are not so much decorations, as they are an offering of ourselves to spirit that can come back to us energized at the end of the dance, a physical remembrance of our good work. And like the evergreen tree with roots that go deep, we must be constant, eternal, and filled with hope at all times, during all seasons, under all conditions, in unity with our relations. The lessons we can learn from the tree are many. It reminds us to stand tall and push ourselves in both directions, upward and downward, so that our growth is sufficiently grounded that we don't topple and fall. We are like the tree, midway between Mother Earth and the sky. At the Dance for All People, we always dance around a living tree. The life of the dance and the prayers of the dancers continue even after the dance closes on Sunday. We need to be mindful of its living nature, that it has a life, and it is not merely a ceremonial object. Much like that of other cultures, and how the Erdtree is represented in Elden Ring, there's a strong belief and acknowledgement of the reciprocal nature between humans and trees, as trees are an excellent representation of the concept of life and rebirth. While there is so much more, and I truly do mean so much more, that I could cover and relate to Elden Ring, I think this video will be long enough as is. Moreover, I would love to make more focused videos in the future covering specific topics and aspects of how Elden Ring relates to other subjects, such as going more in depth on the similarities between runes and Norse mythology and Elden Ring itself. Though, for now, I believe I have presented many of the possible sources of inspiration for the Erdtree in particular, whether they be conscious or unconscious. Creative works are often clever remixes of existing concepts and ideas, and I think Elden Ring is an excellent example of this. As previously mentioned, From Software is no stranger to drawing inspiration from external sources, and it stands to reason that some of their ideas for Elden Ring were subconsciously inspired by concepts they were already aware of. Furthermore, as the Tree of Life is such a consistent and recurring motif among the majority of world religions and cultures, it also stands to reason that there is a great deal of overlap in information sharing that occurred between some cultures, which may also be why some of these connections exist in the first place, as it's likely that these ideas and beliefs would be transferred across regions of the world as humanity continued to advance and develop. In Elden Ring, the Crucible is described as having been the amorphous form of all life, a convergence of all life and matter that led to the creation of the world and creatures we see in-game. The Crucible on a surface level reminds me of the theory of the Big Bang, the idea that our universe was formed from a single point of immense matter and energy that expanded outward. Moreover, some scientists think that the universe may be on a rebound, and that if the Big Bang caused all of this matter to expand outward for a seemingly infinite distance, it could perhaps reach its limit, and once it has reached its limit, much like a rubber band, it's going to snap back to its starting position. The parallels between the Big Bang and the Crucible are readily apparent, especially as it appears that the lands between and Elden Ring are regressing, and this could relate to the law of regression in the Golden Order, which claims that all things yearn eternally to converge, much like the idea that one day the universe may end its expansion and begin its retraction. While I find these parallels to be fascinating, I am more compelled to relate the Crucible to mythological and theological interpretations of the inception of the universe, as I believe several creation myths relate to the concept of the Crucible in Elden Ring quite well. Before going further, I want to give my deepest gratitude to all of those who have subscribed recently and pushed my channel to over 500 subscribers. I can barely believe it. I've been doing this on and off for about 6 years now, and I didn't ever expect to have much of an audience. So thank you all so much for the love as well as your critiques on my recent videos, as well as for providing me with even more lore and theory info. I also want to say before digging deep into today's topics, that a great deal of the ideas and foundations for this video and the concepts therein are inspired by Smowtown, Last Protagonist, and Mad Luigi. So I'm super grateful for their work, and hopefully you'll watch some of their videos if by some chance you haven't already. Now, my fellow Tarnished, let us rise and learn about the Crucible. Ginnungagap is the bottomless abyss that was all there was prior to the creation of the cosmos, and into which the cosmos will collapse once again during Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. As the Eddic poem Völuspá, the insight of the Seeress, describes the time before the cosmos existed. That was the age when nothing was. There was no sand, nor sea, nor cool waves. No earth, nor sky, nor grass there. Only Ginnungagap. In Norse cosmogony, Ymir is the first being to arise from the abyss of Ginnungagap, the void that all life arose from. Though, unlike in Elden Ring, this void was not entirely alone, as Ginnungagap was positioned between Muspelheim, the land of fire, and Niflheim, the land of ice. When the fires of Muspelheim and the ice of Niflheim converged into Ginnungagap, Ymir was born out of the melting ice. Ymir was the first godlike being to arise, and from Ymir other life arose, falling from his body. From Ymir came giants as well as the first of the Aesir gods, Buri, whose son, Bur, would have children with a giantess named Bestla, and these half-god, half-giant offspring were Vili, Ve, and of course, Odin. Eventually, the gods came together to defeat Ymir so they could shape the universe, as little had actually changed other than the existence of life. Thus, once Odin and the other Aesir gods felled Ymir, they used his body to craft the universe from it, using his blood to make oceans and rivers, and using his skin and muscle to make land and vegetation, and so on. Following Ymir's defeat and the reordering of the chaotic cosmos, the gods created the first two humans from tree trunks, named Ask and Embla, and placed a fence around the land of the humans, Midgard, so that they could be protected from the wrath of the giants. Ymir can be viewed thematically and symbolically as the primordial matter from which all life arises. Though it did rise in a void of nothingness, from a pit of chaos and disarray. Ymir is the personification of the concept of chaos, or at the very least, unattained potential, as there is no codification of principles, regulations, or beliefs. Instead, Ymir and the other Jotnar or Jotun, much like the Titans in Greek mythology, are more so representations of formless, chaotic elemental forces, such as freezing cold or scalding flames. Ymir's name can also be translated to Screamer, or to scream, and thus the gods took a formless body of the Screamer and metaphorically created words giving form to the scream. Moreover, as the giants serve a symbolic role of natural forces, it stands to reason that the giants are pretty much always in pursuit of corrupting and destroying the order of the gods, of which they actually succeed during Ragnarok. Though, the statement from medievalist Margaret Clooney's Ross paints the giants as more than chaotic forces of nature. Characteristically, the gods covet important natural resources, which the giants own, then steal them and turn them to their own advantage by utilizing them to create culture. That is, they put the giants' raw materials to work for themselves. These raw materials are of diverse kinds and include intellectual capital, such as the ability to brew ale, as well as the cauldron in which it is made, and abstractions made concrete, like the mead of poetry and the runes of wisdom. This quote is reminiscent of what we currently know about the Crucible in Elden Ring, primarily that all life comes from the Crucible, or Ginnungagap, and that this natural order was harnessed and utilized to create a new age of order and structure. From item descriptions, we can read that during the time of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, the Crucible Knights were a respected component of Godfrey's warriors, and seemingly only fell out of favor when Godfrey was banished by Marika to the Badlands. Moreover, the Crucible is described as being the natural order prior to the Elden Beast and Elden Ring, and it is seemingly associated with the tree that came before the Erdtree, the Great Tree. The Great Tree and Erdtree were said to once be connected at the roots, though this doesn't seem to be the case any longer. Now there is a myriad of hypotheses and theories as to why the Erdtree and Great Tree are no longer connected, such as the creation of the Elden Ring or Godwyn being buried at the roots of the Erdtree. However, we don't currently have any concrete information to say definitively as to why the Erdtree and Great Tree are no longer connected. Though to speculate for a moment, I personally believe the Great Tree was the representation of the Crucible prior to the Elden Ring, and that the Elden Beast rocketed down into the lands between, and defeated the god of the Crucible and Great Tree. The primary piece of evidence for this is the sword that the Tarnished can obtain after defeating the Elden Beast and using the Elden Remembrance, the sacred relic sword. I have been fascinated with this sword ever since I beat Elden Ring for the first time, and that fascination has only grown since beginning to hunt for lore. Initially, when I first got the sword in-game, I was just giddy at how incredibly overpowered the unique skill Wave of Gold was. And then I found myself reading the description of the sword. The description reads as follows: "Sword wrought from the remains of a god who should have lived a life eternal. Thoughts on what the weapon portends are many and varied. Some consider it the mark of a great sin, or a sign of great devastation. Some think of it as the end of an age, while others, the beginning." To me, this is one of those item descriptions that perfectly encapsulates the concept of minimalism, as From Software is aware of what this description is referring to, yet we, the players and audience, could not know just from a cursory glance. The concept is akin to that of an iceberg, or iceberg lists in videos, as I'm sure many of you have seen before. Minimalism, in a literary sense, stresses brevity and minimal exposition, similar to the way From Software games are typically handled. This description tells us that there was once a god who should have never died, and that the death of this god is invariably viewed as an end or beginning of an age. We of course cannot be certain as to what god this description is referring to based on these words alone, though I do believe this to possibly have some major lore implications. The fact the Elden Beast wields the weapon in its fight against the Tarnished implies to me that this weapon is of great power and significance to the Greater Will. Though, why is this? As the description explains, this sword is crafted from the remains of a once-believed immortal deity. Moreover, the sword skill Wave of Gold scales only with faith, and the sword glows a fiery golden hue when used, implying that this now-deceased god, like the Elden Beast and Disciples of the Golden Order, used holy magic to combat its foes. This is supported by the description of the skill, as it says you imbue the sword with bygone golden glory, then fire it at foes. If that weren't enough on its own, when the weapon skill Wave of Gold is used, the bottom rune of the Elden Ring can be seen lighting up on the ground where you cast Wave of Gold. This may suggest that the Elden Ring is invoking the power of this weapon, this now deceased god, a god that may be connected to the Crucible. To me, this item description and visual details of the weapon lend themselves to the implications that the Elden Beast, or Greater Will, slayed the god of the Erdtree or Crucible, and out of their remains they crafted this sword and harnessed the power of this now defeated god to enact their new age of the Golden Order, much as Ymir's body had been used to create order and structure in Norse cosmogony. The Great Tree, Crucible, or Unknown God is the plentiful source from which the Greater Will shaped its Elden Ring and Golden Order. Moreover, the description of the sacred relic sword is quite reminiscent of how the Crucible can be described by different parties in the lands between, as those with connections to the Crucible would have seen the death of their Crucible god as the end of an age, whereas the disciples of the Greater Will would have seen the coming of the Erdtree and Golden Order as the beginning of a new age, one wrought from the corpse of a powerful outer god we have yet to learn almost anything about. I will expand on this concept a bit later, but for now just know that there was a god that was defeated long ago that seems to have a connection to the Great Tree and Crucible, and is the weapon wielded by the Elden Beast within the Erdtree, and that the Elden Ring could perhaps be some sort of containment vessel or refined form of the Crucible. The Crucible is described in-game as being the source of all life as well as the time when all life was blended together. Thus, if the Great Tree was representative of the Crucible prior to the emergence of the Erdtree, then it would explain why the Crimson and Cerulean Amber medallions describe the Amber as having primordial energy inside of them. The sap of the Erdtree is considered to be blessed, and when it hardens it becomes amber, like the amber in the medallions. One of the wrinkles in this theory could be that the sap and amber in these medallions could have perhaps come from the Great Tree, though that may not invalidate the theory entirely, as the Erdtree has grown out from the Great Tree. Thus, they may share the same blessed sap. I also find it difficult to determine definitively whether the sap in the Crimson and Cerulean Amber medallions is from the Great Tree or Erdtree, as the items describe the amber in them as being the most valued jewelry items during the time when Godfrey was Elden Lord. This, along with the fact that the Crucible Knights served under Godfrey, makes me question the timeline of the Erdtree sprouting up, and perhaps it's possible that the Erdtree did not appear until after Godfrey was banished, though this is just speculation. I also find it fascinating that the Crucible was not always so despised among adherents of the Golden Order, and was seemingly tolerated at the very least, as can be seen in Crucible Knights who not only wear primordial gold, but wield aspects of the Crucible, and now fight alongside others who have connections to the Crucible, such as the Misbegotten. Interestingly, gold is significant and sacred to both the Crucible as well as the Golden Order. In Elden Ring, primordial gold is red-tinted, whereas the gold of the Golden Order is pure gold, yet they are both still, well, gold. The Crucible Knights wear primordial gold armor, and wield primordial gold weapons, and the Gravelstone Seal item highlights that even an item relating to the dragons and Crucible was not always disdained by the Golden Order, with a description reading, "Sacred seal made from gravel stone thought to be an ancient dragon scale. Enhances dragon cult incantations of the royal capital. The worship of the ancient dragons does not conflict with the belief in the Erdtree. After all, this seal and lightning itself are both imbued with gold." Both the red and gold forms of lightning in Elden Ring are representative of the Crucible and Golden Order, as the lightning wielded by dragons was likely harnessed directly from the Crucible, hence the red coloration. Moreover, the lightning wielded by Godwyn the Golden is that of a golden yellow because of his connection to the Golden Order in Elden Ring. However, this item does not differentiate between these types of lightning, which may suggest that both red and gold forms of lightning are holy and representative of power attained through the Crucible, with the golden lightning simply being the more refined version of this primordial energy. And yet, since the world was formed from the corpse of a giant, it would seem that the world is what it is largely due to the influence of the giants as well. Aspects of Ymir, his might, his uncouthness, his tendency toward entropy, the ambivalence of his character, remained present in the world even after the gods had shaped it in accordance with a different set of traits and aims. The giants too were thought to intervene in the world, the the slaying of their ancestor by no means vanquished them. Much like in Norse mythology, everything in Elden Ring and the lands between is the direct product of Marika and the Greater Will usurping power from the Crucible. I find the described aspects of Ymir to be pertinent, as uncouthness could refer to lack of refinement, just as the Crucible lacked refinement until the Golden Order. The tendency toward entropy and ambivalence also seem relevant, as entropy can be seen in-game as the frenzied flame, as entropy is the gradual decline into disorder, and the frenzied flame wishes for nothing more than to bring about chaos and burn everything away until only the Crucible remains. In that regard, the frenzied flame can be viewed as an aspect or extension of the Crucible, as the frenzied flame seeks to converge all existence back into what it describes as the One Great, which is very likely the Crucible. Moreover, the quote describes that the world was still greatly influenced by its creation from Ymir's body, much like the Crucible seems to be the origin and influence of what we know as the Golden Order and the Erdtree. The connection between Norse cosmogony and the Crucible and Elden Ring can also be found when reading the final line of this quote. As the gods and progenitors of many blasphemous and accursed beings in the lands between, having persisted despite the authority of the Golden Order, as the misbegotten and Crucible Knights continue to reside within the lands between. Despite scorning those with a connection to the Crucible, the adherents of the Natural Order continue to exist in battle against disciples of the Golden Order. In the Norse view, the world is a battleground between the gods and the giants, whose power is more or less evenly matched. Mankind is in the middle, torn between the opposing claims of holiness, order, and the goodness on the one hand, and profaneness, chaos, and wickedness on the other. This tension is ceaseless, because it's been a feature of the world itself since its very beginning. The strife will only be alleviated by Ragnarok, when the world will be destroyed altogether, and nothing will remain but the stillness and darkness of a new Ginnungagap. While not a perfect comparison, as the Crucible and Golden Order were on better terms at one point, the primary conflict in the lands between appears, at least to me, as being between the Golden Order and the aspects and extensions of the Crucible, which includes but is not limited to giants, misbegotten, omens, and Crucible Knights. The Golden Order is similar to the Norse Aesir gods in that they strive for holiness, order, and goodness, whereas it's propagated that the Crucible represents profaneness, chaos, and wickedness. In his video about omens and the Crucible, Mad Luigi discussed the Crucible talismans, which describes the aspects of the Crucible once having appeared on the flesh of human beings long ago, and can be partially attributed to a form of devolution, which works quite well with the law of regression perhaps actually working as a detriment to the Golden Order, as they were quickly being overtaken by aspects and vestiges of the Crucible. And if you'd like to hear more about my thoughts on the law of regression, I actually went much more in-depth on that topic in my Godwyn the Golden video, so if you're interested, you can go check that one out after this. Anyway, I really liked what Mad Luigi said about the current state of omens versus the state of omens long ago, which is that perhaps during the time of the Crucible, the vestiges and aspects of the Crucible were more uniformly spread out and perhaps were beneficial, unlike how now an omen such as Moog has horns growing mad crazy and stabbing into his own eyeball. I think it's a pretty great idea that the Crucible had its own order and grace of sorts that was bestowed, perhaps more equally, among the lands. Though, as Mad Luigi also points out, not even the Omen twins wish to get back to the time of the Crucible, so perhaps it still wasn't all that great, as it perhaps did not involve much individuality. Nonetheless, being born an Omen during the current age of the Golden Order certainly isn't to anyone's benefit. Another interesting item and symbol is the Erdtree seal, as this is what appears when aspects of the Crucible incantations are used. Furthermore, the Crucible incantations are described as ancient Erdtree incantations, reinforcing the connection between the Erdtree and the Crucible. They are also described as being manifestations of the Erdtree's primal vital energies, an aspect of the primordial Crucible. These descriptions greatly reinforce, to me anyway, that the Erdtree draws upon or has refined the essence of the Crucible itself. Thus the Golden Order is likely tied to the Crucible itself, yet currently scorns and degrades the Crucible nonetheless, the probable source of the Elden Ring's power. I'm also deeply curious as to why Godfrey was banished, and why this is also when the Crucible began to be despised by the Golden Order, with my wildest hypothesis on this being that there was a god in control of the Great Tree or Crucible prior to the Greater Will, and that it wasn't until that god was killed and formed into the Sacred Relic Sword did the Erdtree sprout. Though that is just an idea I really like, but there's not really a whole lot of evidence to support it, other than perhaps implications presented by the Sacred Relic Sword, though there are possibly some timeline issues with it. I wonder if the Great Tree or Erdtree could parallel the Well of Erd in Norse mythology, as this is one of the 3 wells that support Yggdrasil, though the Well of Erd is the one that controls the fate of the tree in that it keeps the tree healthy. Moreover, this is where the Norns, the weavers of all fate for mankind, were located, and through Yggdrasil could change the fate and laws of the cosmos, much as whosoever holds the Elden Ring can in the lands between. A commenter recently posited the idea that the Outer Gods are Lovecraftian perversions of the Norns, and I kind of agree with that. The Outer Gods largely reside outside of the lands between, hence the term Outer Gods, and perhaps outside of this realm of existence entirely, which is very Lovecraftian in nature, especially as they can influence the world while they are not even present. Moreover, they could be representative of the Norns in that they are all staking claim to what can be viewed as a Well of Erd, with the Elden Ring effectively being able to change the fate of those in the lands between. Moreover, they could be representative of the Norns in that they are all staking claim to what can be viewed as a Well of Erd, with the Elden Ring effectively being able to change the fate of those in the lands between. So, while just speculation, perhaps the Erdtree or Great Tree is simply the center of power in the universe, as is perhaps the representation of the Crucible in some form, and the powerful Outer Gods wish to claim this for themselves. Regardless of whether or not that parallel holds any weight, I wonder if there was another god that the Greater Will usurped power from that resided within the Great Tree. If this were so, then perhaps this is the same god that the dragons once worshipped. After all, we don't really know what happened to the god of the dragons, nor do we have a name either. Though, what we do know is that Placidusax was once an Elden Lord in an age predating the Erdtree and Golden Order. This has always been such an interesting part of the lore to me, as it of course conflicts with Godfrey being the first Elden Lord, though perhaps Godfrey was the first Elden Lord with the Greater Will in control of the Elden Ring. This seems to fit with the Sacred Relic Sword description as well, as the power in the lands changing from one outer god to another would be seen as both the beginning and end of an age, particularly if the Erdtree were to have sprouted once the god was slain. We also know that the aspects and vestiges of the Crucible can be variably described as both dragon-like as well as beast-like. The tail, horns, and flame-breathing would all suggest a dragon or lizard-like being, which isn't all that dramatic considering the Greater Will's seemingly aquatic appearance. Moreover, we've never really seen an outer god in its true form, so who knows if there are any limits on what they could look like, and this could perhaps lend itself to the Lovecraftian aspect. However, what the Outer Gods are exactly is quite the mystery thus far, though I do personally believe the Sacred Relic Sword is hinting at something significant, such as the previous wielder of the Elden Ring, or the power of the Crucible, or whatever significance or power the Erdtree and Great Tree hold. The weapon is wielded by the Elden Beast, who also likely forged it into the Sacred Relic Sword to use in battle, as clearly a great deal of holy energy remains in the blade, perhaps remnants of the god's life force that was once connected to the Great Tree. Whether or not this god would have been representative of the dragons, the Crucible, or both, is hard to say, as connections can be made but nothing can really be confirmed without a shadow of a doubt. But that's what makes all of this so much fun. It's like we're all a bunch of detectives. Placidusax can breathe a golden flame reminiscent of the holy magic used in the Golden Order and by the Elden Ring, as well as the Sacred Relic Sword, and this is probably a vestige of his time as Elden Lord, when he was connected to the Great Tree and his outer god, who or whatever they may be. One final note is that the Elden Beast is said to be the Elden Ring itself, which again leads me to believe that the Elden Ring is a containment unit of power of some sort that is linked to the Great Tree and now Erdtree, and by extension, the Crucible, as Placidusax couldn't have been Elden Lord prior to there having been some variation at least of the Elden Ring. This also seems to fit well with the idea that the power to control and alter the laws of the lands between is connected to the Great Tree and Erdtree, and Crucible in some way, and thus outer gods seek to control the power concentrated therein. Though, to be honest, I've tried to piece as many bits of information together I could in order to try and create a coherent idea of what the Crucible is and represents and how it may relate to a deceased outer god, but a great deal of it could be boiled down to speculation, though I'd like to believe I presented my case quite well. And as I mentioned earlier, I just feel like everyone who makes or watches videos like this one are just detectives trying to piece together what everything means and how all of these vague and convoluted pieces fit together. Who are the Numen? Who are the Nox? Better yet, who are the Nightfolk? In Elden Ring, both Numen and Nightfolk are playable character races that can represent the Tarnished throughout the journey to become Elden Lord. However, the Numen and Nightfolk are among the most mysterious aspects of the whole game, with the Nightfolk often being overlooked as we simply aren't provided with much information about them. Of course, there is also the Nox, the underground dwellers of the Eternal Cities, a people we know to be at odds with the Greater Will, and choose to wait for their Lord of Night. In this video, I aim to discuss some of the key information we have on the Numen, Nox, and Nightfolk respectively. I also try to discern what each of these races could parallel or represent analogues for in history and mythology, as I believe a few to be connections to be too strong not to mention. We'll start with the Numen, as we arguably know the most about them in comparison to the Nox and Nightfolk. While players can choose to play as a male Numen, we only see female Numen in-game, such as Marika and the Black Knife Assassins. It's difficult to say whether or not all Numen are actually female considering the option to play as a male Numen, though that easily could be there to make sure the options for character creation are the same across each race. It's also not impossible, however, to think that there may be male Numen, we just don't simply see any. Aside from the fact that we still don't know if all Numen are female, they appear to parallel the Numenorians, or Dundanes, from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Numenor is an island gifted to the Dundanes after a great battle, and are also gifted with extra long lives, as well as great wisdom. Moreover, they are described as being massive humanoid beings that have golden hair, which, on a surface level, does parallel what we know of the Numen race quite well. While we still don't know where the Numen originate from, another island could be considered another world by some, or by another world, perhaps it's meant to mean a place far from the lands between. I could also see this fitting well if they are truly based on the Numenorians, as the island of Numenor was sunk, and perhaps the Numen could be from another land or island that was destroyed or sunk by a greater power. Though I personally still think the Numen are likely descended from another world or realm or dimension or whatever you want to call it. I think it just fits with the current story as Marika, a Numen, was chosen to become the vessel for the Elden Ring and effectively become a god. And up to this point, we still don't know if outer gods are called thus because they exist outside the Lands Between, or outside the world the Lands Between resides in. It would be somewhat fitting for being seemingly inspired by H.P. Lovecraft to exist outside the dimension we are able to see in-game. And perhaps this is where the Numen come from as well. We are told they are supposed denizens of another world, and do seemingly have an innate ability to become and give birth to Empyreans, as can be seen when Marika becomes the vessel for the Elden Ring, and subsequently the progenitor of the Golden Order and Golden Lineage. The Numen could also be somewhat representative of the Tuatha De Danann, or the tribes or people of Danu. The Tuatha are a supernatural race of humanoid beings that come from the Otherworld, the realm of gods and the dead, which is also sometimes called Tir na Nog in Celtic mythology, which I've referenced a couple times in previous videos. The Tuatha are typically seen as more or less the good guys in Celtic mythology, and were foils to the Fomorians, which were akin to the giants of Norse mythology, representing chaotic forces of nature. As the name of Tribe of Danu implies, the Tuatha are the people of Danu, who is the primordial goddess that is alluded to throughout Celtic mythology, and is sometimes referred to as a triple goddess, though this has been somewhat disputed as the number 3 and triple goddesses were already a somewhat common motif in Celtic myths. However, Danu is also said to have a duality to her personality, with a motherly nurturing side, as well as a warring and malevolent side. Aside from the idea of her being a triple goddess, the dual nature of her character is very reminiscent of Marika and Radagon, especially as it seems Marika's drives and motivations differ from her other half, Radagon. So perhaps there's something there, as Elden Ring appears to have many sources of inspiration, and George R.R. Martin did help create the foundation of the world building, and it isn't too far-fetched to think there is a decent amount of Celtic mythology and history from the British Isles still remaining in the final product. The word Numen can also be variably translated to god, divine, or divinity, among others in Latin. Whether intentional or not, The choice of naming the Numen is interesting either way. If the inspiration is primarily from Tolkien's Númenóreans, they are described as being the most noble race of men that eventually betrayed the ones who granted them their long lives and home. This could fit with what we know about the Numen, as they are from outside the lands between and are a long-lived race. Though we don't have any evidence to suggest the Numen betrayed a god or godly figures. Though if they are truly denizens from another world, why do they not still live in that other world? If the inspiration is primarily based on a race like the Tuatha, it would also fit with what we know about the Numen, as the Tuatha are essentially a demigod race of beings from the Celtic otherworld, with long-lasting lives. Moreover, the Tuatha are described as typically being tall with red or blonde hair and pale skin, which fits Marika's description, as well as Radagon's, though obviously we still don't know really who or what Radagon is, and could easily not be a Numen at all. The Tuatha are also really interesting as they are not all necessarily all that similar in appearance, as some accounts describe some of the Tuatha as being skilled magicians, where other portions were akin to fallen angels while others were straight up gods. This is again a nice parallel to Marika, as she is the only known Numen to achieve godhood, though Numen are still formidable combatants, as seen with the Black Knife assassins. Another quick connection is that Roman emperors were sometimes referred to as a Numen, as it was a way to identify the emperor as having been chosen by God, or to have nearly godlike status due to their position. Pretty neat. If you've been down some rabbit holes on Reddit or other forum sites, or just have watched videos discussing it, there's evidence to suggest that the Nox and Numen are the same, or at the very least are related to one another, with the Numen coming before the Nox or vice versa. Ragier describes the Black Knife assassins to have been scions of the Eternal City, though the Black Knife armor says they are rumored to be the Numen and have close ties with Marika. This of course also lends itself to other theories such as Marika being behind the Knight of the Black Knives, though I'm not really focusing on that one at the moment, and several other people have done incredible jobs covering that theory. Regardless, there is a connection between the Nox and Nightfolk that is yet to be fully revealed, and hopefully there are actually answers and we aren't being led on by the sweet nothings of Daddy Miyazaki. A quick note I had on this connection is the dichotomy of gold and silver, as silver is strongly associated with the Nox and Eternal Cities, whereas gold is associated with Marika and the Golden Order. I've read a few theories suggesting Marika is the creation of the Nox or Numen, and while I find this idea appealing, I think the importance of gold to Marika and the Greater Will doesn't seem to fit with the importance of silver to the Nox. Though perhaps this could be the divide between the Nox and Numen. The Nox are represented by the moon and cold silver, whereas the Numen are represented by Marika and thus the warmth of gold and light. Maybe the connection between the two groups is as simple as the Nox being those who refused the Greater Will, whereas the Numen are those that sided with the Greater Will and Marika. After all, the Nox are banished beneath the ground in their eternal cities. I think another connection that's a little less apparent is the combat styles of the Nox and Numen, as both groups of enemies have very quick and flowing attacks, particularly the Nox Swordstress and Night Maiden, whom both have attack styles similar to that of the Black Knife assassins. Coming back to the connections with the Tuatha De Danann, after a great battle, the Tuatha, or at least a great deal of them, as some may have also gone back to the other world, are driven to live underground. I absolutely loved learning about this, as it could parallel the relationship between the Nox and Numen, as the Tuatha were driven underground and effectively banished, just as the Nox were banished by the Greater Will. So perhaps the only difference is that the Numen remained above ground, whereas the Nox were forced to live under a false night sky. Nyx is also the name of a goddess from Greek mythology, later called Nox by the Romans. Nox or Nyx means night or darkness, and Nox was indeed the goddess of the night, thus the naming of the people of the Eternal Cities is clearly intentional. Moreover, the Nox are shown to be driven to create life, and perhaps their own lord through the use of silver mimic tears, which also can be connected back to the goddess Nyx. Nyx was not only the goddess of the night, but could also create life and promote fertility. Furthermore, while being a goddess of the night, she also had manipulation over light, which again seems fitting with magic manipulation in the Eternal Cities that created the false stars we see in-game. The goddess Nyx, in general, was incredibly powerful, and was even feared by Zeus himself, who in this situation could be represented by Marika or the Greater Will. as gold and lightning are common motifs of the Greater Will. Perhaps the Nox are not just Numen who rejected the Greater Will, but people who worship a separate outer god, perhaps the outer god of the moon, which may have been seen as a greater affront than simply refusing the grace of the Greater Will. This also would solidify the relationship between Ranni and the Eternal Cities. The Nox also seem to have been attempting to recreate their own version of the Golden Order, that I will now coin as the Silver Order. So watch out, I own the trademark now. Anyway, we know the Nox sought to separate themselves entirely from the influence of the Greater Will, and sought to create their own lord similar to an Elden Lord. While they could have just been copying the Golden Order, the Nox also could have been setting the landscape for their outer god, to take the mantle as the primary source of power and influence over the lands between. At the very least, we know the Nox share a connection with the Numen, are at odds with the Greater Will, and have a desire to create life, as seen by the Silver Mimic Tears and Dragonkin soldiers. Another quick connection I wanted to mention was to that of Artemis and Apollo, as Artemis is the goddess of the moon as well, and is strongly associated with silver, which could have served as an influence for the Nox, similar to that of Nyx. Apollo is also often associated with the color gold, as he is the sun god, and this could again relate to the contrast of gold in the Golden Order and silver among the Nox people. Now, to start tying things together, I need to discuss the Nightfolk, which we easily know far less about than the Numens and Nox. With both the Numen and Nox, they can actually be encountered and fought in-game, as there are no Nightfolk enemies or NPCs in Elden Ring at all as far as I am aware. It's an interesting choice as they are such an intriguing race from both a visual standpoint as well as a lore standpoint. After all, they are called Nightfolk, and apparently bled silver long ago. Right away that sets alarm bells off for me, and it probably should for you as well, as their appearance not only suggests they are people who may have been nocturnal or worshipped the night or the moon, but the fact they once had silver blood immediately connects them to the Nox and Eternal Cities, as silver is kind of their whole thing. The fact we don't encounter any Nightfolk during our quest to become Elden Lord seems puzzling at first, though this could have been an intentional lore choice, as perhaps the Nightfolk don't really exist in large quantities, at least not separately from the Nox. I've seen many people alluding to the idea that the Nox and Nightfolk are one and the same, and honestly, I think there's some decent evidence to suggest that they are at least related, similar to the relationship between the Nox and Numen. My initial hypothesis on the connection between the Nightfolk and Nox was that the Nox actually used or even possibly enslaved the Nightfolk in order to further their attempts at creating their own Elden Lord. Though, as we don't know nearly anything about them, it's not exactly a concrete hypothesis. However, this could explain the in-game absence of the Nightfolk, as well as the abundance of silver in the Eternal Cities, as the Nightfolk had been their plentiful supply, as it was their blood, which may also help explain why silver mimic tears are typically seen in a more liquid-like state. Though, perhaps the relationship between the Nightfolk and Nox was not so malicious after all, and was maybe even an assimilation of the Nightfolk with the newly banished Numen. To explain, the Numen are seen to be more fair-skinned like Marika, whereas the Nox appear similar in appearance with their greyish skin. The Nox may only appear as they do because they are emerging of Numen and Nightfolk. Or perhaps I'm looking way too deep, and Nox and Nightfolk could actually be interchangeable terms for the same group of people, though that would admittedly discount the Numen connection. Going back to the Nyx connection, if From Software was inspired at all by the Greek/Roman goddess, it would be an interesting change to the mythos, as Nyx can create life and is symbolized by the moon and stars, and the silver blood of the Nightfolk may have been used as an attempt to replicate abilities similar to that of a god. Regardless, the Nightfolk are few in number and seemingly have a connection to the Eternal Cities through their once silver blood that is now maybe being used to create new forms of life. I also wonder if the Nox and Nightfolk being related could also explain one of the primary differences between the Nox and Numen other than skin color, that being the presence of males in the Eternal Cities. Again, we do not actually know for certain whether or not Marika comes from an all-female race, though there isn't direct evidence of there being a male Numen in-game, as their warriors are also women. However, in the Eternal Cities, Nox monks and priests can also be found, and they are male. Now, this could point to the Nox simply being separate from the Numen, but I personally think this helps confirm that the Nox are some form of Numen. The Black Knife Assassins are rumored to be scions of the Eternal Cities, and Numen runes can be found near one of the Eternal Cities, again solidifying the connection between the two. Moreover, we also know that the Numen are long-lived but seldom born, and this could be a factor of them possibly being an all-female race, as we don't really know how they reproduce. Maybe, when many of the Numen were banished underground, they encountered the Nightfolk, and through combined efforts, built the Eternal Cities and crafted a false night sky. While I don't have an explanation as to why the Nightfolk would have been underground, I don't really find it to be a far-fetched idea, as whole civilizations are buried beneath the lands between. The Numen and Nightfolk coming into contact to form the Nox would explain their appearance that is much more akin to that of the Nightfolk than Numen, as well as the Nox's fascination with silver mimic tears. I also have a sneaking suspicion that the covering of female Nox through clothing such as the Nox Swordstress crown could be representative of a change that occurred in Nox culture, as a result of being at least a primarily female race that came in contact with a race that was more patriarchal. While entirely speculation, I wonder if the Numen who were banished underground lived under a more matriarchal system, whereas the Nightfolk embodies a more patriarchal system. If there's any truth to this, I think it could help explain as to why there are still religious female figures and warriors among the Nox, though they have their eyes covered, whereas the male Nox do not cover their eyes, and are capable of earning the title of priest among the Nox, while females don't seemingly earn that high a title. It is not unheard of for women to have to cover parts of their body in certain cultures and religions, and perhaps the Nox are the female Numen who were strong-armed by the Nightfolk. The Nox being a product of the Numen and Nightfolk assimilating with one another can also help illuminate the source of their worship of the night, moon, and stars. The Nightfolk, as their name implies, are people of the night and bled silver, and perhaps the Numen were not aware of the power of silver, or the possible outer god of the night or moon. With Marika so connected to gold, I find it poetic to think that the Numen banished underground, perhaps by Marika through instruction from the Greater Will, would seek out silver as their source of power, a color and substance often viewed as the inverse of gold. Whether or not Marika was instrumental in banishing the Nox, Marika sided with the Greater Will, and the Nox wished to undermine this relationship, which I believe to be a detail that can point toward a link between the Nox and Marika. After all, the Nox are said to have invoked the ire of the Greater Will long ago, and perhaps this ire was not following in Marika's footsteps, and rather than slaying them, they were banished underground, as Marika perhaps did not want her entire race to perish, regardless of their choice to reject the Greater Will. This could be fitting with Marika's supposed connection to the Knight of the Black Knives as well, as Marika may have been playing the long con, and actually sought to assist her banished people. I also find this to match up with the Nox trying to create their own Silver Order, especially if you believe Marika orchestrated Godwyn's assassination, as it could arguably have laid the groundwork for another Elden Lord to rise from the Eternal Cities, as the Nox are of the same stock as Marika, and were informed on how to go about creating their own Silver Order and Lord of Night. Though, like I say often, there's a great deal of speculation here, but I just love speculating on this stuff. There's just so many directions and paths one could take when trying to elucidate nearly any topic in this game. Sorry if this one was a bit more all over the place than some of my other videos, but I am just really fascinated by the possible connections between the Numen, Nox, and Nightfolk, and I really feel like I'm onto something with the Nightfolk and Nox being related, and how that eventually connects back to the Numen like Marika. I certainly don't think I have all the answers, nor do I really think From Software has given us all the answers, but I think some of the connections I presented between the three races are fairly plausible, especially there being some sort of close relationship between the Nox and Nightfolk. I was also fascinated learning about the Tuatha De Danann and Tolkien's Dunedains, and the parallels between those fictional races and the fictional race of the Numen. The gods found themselves unable to speak, as they trembled with anguish and fear. They knew that this event was the first presage of Ragnarok, the downfall and death not just of themselves, but of the very cosmos they maintained. In Norse mythology, the death of the Aesir god, Balder, is the first sign of Ragnarok. which can be translated as End of an Era, Twilight of the Gods, Fate of the Gods, or Doom of the Gods. In Elden Ring, the precipitating event for the Shattering, the great war between the demigod children of Queen Marika, was the death of Godwyn the Golden on the Night of the Black Knives. The death of Godwyn destabilized the lands between, likely due to Godwyn serving as a symbol of sorts for the Golden Order. As Godwyn is the only demigod child of Marika and Godfrey that is not Numen, and is the progenitor of the golden lineage that was used to propagate faith and adherence to the Golden Order. I find it fascinating how many similarities can be found between Godwyn the Golden and Baldur of the Aesir gods. I've already presented the primary similarity between the two characters, which is that both of these godly figures were each assassinated, events that each subsequently led to chaos and destruction in both Norse mythology and in Elden Ring. More specifically, the significance of Baldur, as well as Godwyn, is primarily centered upon their deaths, as their deaths are catalysts for events that directly threaten the gods and universe itself. In Norse mythology, Baldur was considered to be a god of light, wisdom, and courage, though these were never official titles. Similarly, Godwyn is shown to have been the most beloved and resplendent of Marika's demigod children, hence the moniker Godwyn the Golden. Now, to redeem myself for mistakes made in my previous lore video, I will recount the assassination of Baldur. Baldur was born to Odin and Frigg, and was a twin to the blind god of the night, Hoder. Early on in his life, his mother and Vanir goddess, Frigg, crafted a spell or enchantment to protect Baldur from all ailments, both physical and magical. However, she did not protect him from mistletoe, as it seemed to be so meager and harmless a material. Later on, though, in Baldur's life, he was beloved by all the gods and considered the most beautiful and just of them all. Yet Loki, who in many ways can be viewed as the architect of Ragnarok, learns of Baldur's weakness, and upon acquiring this information, he crafts an arrow, or spear in some versions, from sharpened mistletoe and tricks Baldur's twin Hoder into firing the mistletoe arrow, which strikes home and ends Baldur's life. Though in one version of the tale, the mistletoe greatly weakens Baldur, and he is killed by someone in his weakened state, likely Loki in disguise. The gods were dumbfounded that this could have occurred, and Loki was imprisoned for having caused Baldur's death, not long after the assassination and shortly before the start of Ragnarok. After Baldur's physical body was given a burial sea, Hermod went to Helheim to try and retrieve Baldur's soul. However, he would ultimately be unsuccessful. Hermod claimed that all beings, especially the gods, yearned for the return of Baldur. The condition set by the goddess Hel for Baldur's soul to be relinquished from her domain was that all beings in existence must weep for Baldur, and his soul would be returned. If this is so, then let everything in the cosmos weep for him, and I will send him back to you. But if any refuse, he will remain in my presence. While everyone in the universe cried and wept simultaneously, Loki held back tears and prevented himself from crying a single drop of liquid, and thus, Baldur's soul was to remain in Helheim. The inability to recover Baldur's soul is when many of the gods knew Ragnarok was soon to come. Much like Baldur is the most beloved god, Godwyn was the most beloved demigod, yet they each met their end quite unceremoniously. Elden Ring's story insinuates that the Rune of Death was necessary to kill Godwyn's soul, as well as Ranni's body, suggesting there was some level of invulnerability the demigods possessed. And perhaps the moniker Godwyn the Golden also related to him being a symbol of purity and invulnerability for the Golden Order itself. While Godwyn could easily be an analog for Baldur, I also believe that Ranni's actions on the Night of the Black Knives could parallel Hoder's actions when tricked by Loki. While Ranni is not the twin of Godwyn, she is, at least with the current information available, a half-sibling of Godwyn, and she represents the cold night in the moon, which seems to be the inverse of Godwyn the Golden's propensity toward the golden light of the Golden Order. A surface-level parallel is that, like Loki, Ranni betrays and attempts to free herself from the god. Moreover, if you subscribe to the theory that Marika is the one who orchestrated the Night of the Black Knives, it makes me wonder how much of Ranni's actions were of her own free will, and not actually manipulated by Marika. In this scenario, Marika could parallel the efforts of Loki, who was paving the road for Ragnarok, and perhaps it could be argued that Marika was similarly paving the way for the Shattering, as she had perhaps become disillusioned by the Greater Will and its Golden Order. However, I could also understand how the Night of the Black Knives could have been solely on the shoulders of Ranni, especially if it were to more directly parallel the death of Baldur, as Baldur's mother Frigg would not have wanted this to happen to her son. So we must ask ourselves, would Marika have let her most beloved son be killed? Or is she cold and calculated enough to have planned Godwyn's death herself? In the tale of Baldur's death, his soul goes to Helheim, which rests below Yggdrasil, much like Baldur's soulless body resting at the roots of the Erdtree. While not explicitly mentioned in Norse mythology, it would seem as though the Norse Aesir gods wanted to return Baldur's soul to Asgard, likely Valhalla specifically, as he was no mere mortal and had always resided in the land of the gods. A parallel can be drawn between Baldur's soul being unable to leave Helheim and Godwyn being unable to die a true death, such as Miquella had tried to achieve for him to no avail. In both cases, the current condition of the golden god/demigod was to bring them true peace in death, though in both instances this could not be achieved. Baldur's soul could not be rescued from below the Erdtree, and Godwyn's body could not be truly laid to rest beneath the Erdtree. As Baldur's death is his primary claim to fame in Norse mythology, it's difficult for me to say the next parallel is for certain, though I do find the choice of having Baldur travel via dragon in the 2018 God of War game to be an interesting choice. I've not been able to find any sources that detail Baldur befriending Dragon, though he was seen as an energetic and diplomatic god, so perhaps it's possible. Regardless of whether or not there are documents discussing it, Baldur in the God of War game clearly has some relationship with the dragons, similar to Godwyn having fought and befriended the dragon Fortisax, a dragon who, along with Miquella, would attempt to provide Godwyn with a true death of body and soul. While not a huge find, it's interesting to me that Godwyn shares so many similarities with the god Baldur, especially one that relates to the interpretation of Baldur in a separate game. As is well known by now, Godwyn's burial at the roots of the Erdtree corrupted the Erdtree and the lands between, causing an influx of death roots to arise in the lands between, and subsequently gave rise to those who live in death. They appear as slightly larger skeletal humans. While they attack slowly, if they're not properly killed, they'll continue to reanimate. To properly kill them, one must continue attacking them when they have a white glow until it dissipates, indicating it's truly dead. Death roots are aspects of the Rune of Death, and now they are proliferating the lands between, giving rise to those who live in death, of which Godwyn is the first, hence the title Godwyn, Prince of Death, as he is the first of those who live in death. Deathroot lore is a bit of a contentious topic at times, as it's not entirely clear as to the effects it has on the lands between other than giving rise to those who live in death. Essentially, those who are dead yet cannot seem to die. They live in a constant state of death, unable to be reborn or absorbed into the Erdtree. One of the most fascinating finds recently is the elucidation as to how Godwyn's visage can be seen underneath Stormveil Castle, with the answer being simply Deathroot. If one is to look closely at veins of festering Deathroot growing not only underneath Stormveil Castle, but across the lands between, eyes can be seen emerging from the Deathroot almost as if Godwyn's body is spreading itself out in the form of Deathroot across the lands, which begs the question of how involved Godwyn is in this, as he seemingly is a lifeless husk, yet perhaps something else is using Godwyn's body as a vessel for death. While it's a revelation to learn that Godwyn's malformed likeness seems to be manifesting itself all across the lands between, we still do not have clear answers as to why Godwyn looks like a deformed chimera, just like I don't have clear answers as to why so few people who watch my videos are subscribed. But whatever. Another item I think could hold a great deal of lore significance is the Prince of Death's pustule, which can be found on a corpse near the grotesque aspect of Godwyn that is growing in the crypt of Stormveil Castle. The pustule reads as follows: a fetid pustule taken from facial flesh, raises vitality. Vitality governs resistance to the effects of death. It is said that this pustule came from the visage of the Prince of Death, he who used to be called Godwyn, as first dead of the demigods. It's said he's buried deep under the capital, at the Erdtree's roots. So the Prince of Death's pustule is not only found nearby an aspect of Godwyn's corpse, but the description informs us that this is taken from facial flesh, which is almost undoubtedly the flesh of Godwyn. The item itself also mirrors how Deathroot spreads and grows throughout the lands between, as it appears as though eyes are forming on this pustule as well. The fact that this item and an aspect of Godwyn's corpse can be found here, it does beg the question as to why there is an ulcerated tree spirit in the Stormveil Castle crypt as well. Furthermore, another item called the Prince of Death's cyst, which appears visually similar to the pustule, reads, a fetid overgrown cyst taken from facial flesh, greatly raises vitality. Vitality governs resistance to the effects of death. It is said that this cyst came from the corrupted visage of one unable to die a true death. Indeed, it comes from the Prince of Death, scion of the Golden Bow, and first of the dead among the demigods. Now, I believe there to be an ulcerated tree spirit near the aspect of Godwyn's corpse in Stormveil Castle, as these tree spirits are effectively the offspring of Godwyn's death. To explain, the tree avatars that we see protecting minor Erdtrees throughout the game only came into existence after the Shattering, as it was the Erdtree's will to protect its seeds and sprouts, and the Staff of the Avatar and Guardian Bracers items insinuate that the guardians of the minor Erdtrees transformed into Erdtree avatars after the Shattering, as the item descriptions read, ceremonial staff depicting the Erdtree in its historic radiance, wielded by the avatars who protected the minor Erdtrees. The avatars, emerging in the wake of the Elden Ring's shattering, were determined to protect the withering Erdtree's offspring. Engraved golden bracers, worn by the guardians of the minor Erdtrees. In accordance with an ancient pact to the Erdtree, it is said that their deaths led not to destruction, but instead to be renewed, eternal life as guardians. However, as ulcerate means develop into or become affected by an ulcer, and an ulcer can be defined as an open sore on an external or internal surface of the body, caused by a break in the skin or mucous membrane that fails to heal. The ulcerated tree spirits are likely symptoms of Godwyn being buried at the roots of the Erdtree, as they are typically grotesque and appear to be festering with disease. They could perhaps be viewed as the inverse of the tree avatars, as the tree spirits are corrupted, festering components of the Erdtree, whereas the tree avatars appear this way because of a pact the guardians of the minor Erdtrees made while still humans. These tree spirits are effectively cursed by Godwyn, as the deathroot has likely corrupted them, as they are perhaps meant to be carriers of golden seeds, as you do typically receive a golden seed for defeating a tree spirit. Moreover, the tree spirits oftentimes appear in locations that are related to Godwyn in some way, such as the tree spirit seemingly guarding the aspect of Godwyn's corpse and pustule, as well as one in the mountain tops of the Giants that guards a chest containing deathroot. The tree spirits serve as another example of how influential Godwyn's death and burial have become, as these spirits represent the death and corruption that is festering within the Erdtree's roots. This corruption is also present in another item description, that of the Death Prince's staff embedded with sullied amber, said to be a very part of the Prince of Death, enhances death sorceries. One of the staves deemed heretical by the Academy for its ability to allow sorceries to be augmented through faith in addition to intelligence. The Death Prince's staff description describes the staff as being embedded with sullied amber, which harkens back to the sap of the Erdtree, as the sap becomes amber over time and depending on the type of sap can be used for different purposes, such as restoring health or stamina. However, now Godwyn's corpse has putrefied the sap of the Erdtree, hence the term sullied amber. This amber no longer has the same properties given by the grace of the Erdtree. To sully something means to damage the purity or integrity of, defile. To compare, take a look at the descriptions of the Crimson Amber Medallion, as well as the description for the Cerulean Amber Medallion, which both explain that the Erdtree's old sap becomes amber, treasured as the most precious of jewels in the Age of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. A primordial life energy resides within. This description serves as another example that Godwyn's death and corruption of the Erdtree likely accelerated the law of regression within the Golden Order, as several items describe how people never thought that the Erdtree would not be a symbol of purity and protection, yet the death of Godwyn swiftly brought an end to this golden age. Moreover, I think these items demonstrate that the deathroot is being spread through the sap of the Erdtree, sap that prior to having been infected by Godwyn's corpse, was a great boon and blessing for the people in the lands between. My opinion and speculation on the matter of Godwyn's appearance is that he has become a representation of the Crucible, as the Crucible is defined as the time when all life was blended and arose from, and I think that Godwyn's unusual soul death, along with the body death of Ranni, has led to Godwyn's corpse taking on aspects of the Crucible. We know that the Crucible in some form is the primordial version of the Erdtree, and by extension the Elden Ring itself. Perhaps because Godwyn was not given a proper death, this triggered the law of regression within the Golden Order, as now the rules of life and death set by the Elden Ring have been broken, leading to regression and breakdown of the Golden Order, which, in my opinion, is simply a way to contain the power and energy of the Crucible in the first place. As mentioned, the law of regression is built into the Golden Order, and this could be the reason why Morgott and Mohg are omens, as they were born with the aspects of the Crucible, the more untamed version of the Elden Ring. I don't exactly know why Godwyn was not born an omen. He does seem to still be connected to the Crucible, as he slowly becomes what almost appears to be a physical representation of the Crucible, as he appears to be merging of several forms of life. Perhaps the law of regression works on a faster timeline than many would expect, as Godwyn was the firstborn of Marika and Godfrey, and had no readily apparent flaws, yet their next children were considered to be blasphemous in their very existence. Moreover, it's clear that the law of regression is also at work on Godwyn's golden lineage, as Godric appears to be a shadow of what Godwyn once was, generations prior. Furthermore, part of the description of the law of regression says, "Regression is the pole of meaning, that all things yearn eternally to converge." Thus, perhaps Godwyn's death sped up the process of the Golden Order, and lands between converging back into the primordial Crucible. I wonder then, if Godwyn died an unnatural death in regards to the way life and death are currently handled by the Elden Ring, and that this break in the Golden Order perhaps paved a way for the Crucible to slowly seep back into the lands between, actively accelerating the return of the Crucible. While I would like to delve even deeper into the Crucible in an upcoming video, My current belief about the Crucible is that it represented the natural order of life in the cosmos, and the Elden Ring was a way to harness and control this power, specifically by the outer god, the Greater Will, much how Odin gained immense power over the cosmos after discovering runes. Thus, once the Golden Order set by the Elden Ring was in jeopardy, the power of the Crucible began to seep out and cause disarray, as now the Natural Order and Golden Order are at direct odds with one another, and the mortals and the lands between must take the brunt of these conflicting forces. Though Godwyn has been given the title of Prince of Death, perhaps a more fitting name would be Prince of the Crucible, or Crucible Prince, as he may be a conduit through which aspects of the Crucible are manifesting, such as the Principle of Death, which is currently missing from the Golden Order, though is almost undoubtedly an aspect of the Crucible, the melting pot from which all life arose. Moreover, if you use Fia's Mending Rune, then you restore the Principle of Death to the Golden Order. Unlike Morgott and Mohg, who still have their souls and thus have a stronger connection to the Golden Order and its principles, Godwyn's soulless corpse may be the perfect conduit for the Crucible to manifest itself, as he is simply an empty shell that can be used by primordial forces to reclaim the lands between. Thanks for watching, and if you're interested in seeing more lore and theory videos like this one, consider subscribing to the channel and commenting on what you'd like to see next. In the meantime though, make sure you drink some water and go touch some grass.